For roughly 2 million years, the human visual system spent most of its waking hours focused on objects between 6 meters and infinity, scanning for predators at distance, tracking prey across open terrain, reading weather from cloud formations on the horizon. The ciliary muscles inside your eyes, the muscles that change the shape of the lens to focus at different distances, spent the vast majority of their evolutionary history in a relaxed state, because focusing at distance is the eye's resting position. Close focus is the work. In the last 50 years, the average human has shifted to spending more than 90% of waking hours focused within 2 feet of their face, on screens, on pages, on phones held at reading distance for hours without interruption. The ciliary muscles that spent 2 million years resting are now in sustained contraction for 10 to 14 hours a day. Eyes are not tired. They are locked. There is a reason distance focus requires no muscular effort, and the physics of why was described by Hermann von Helmholtz in 1855. There is a condition called accommodative spasm, in which the ciliary muscle, after hours of near work, fails to release when the person looks into the distance, producing blurred vision that is muscular, not optical. And there is a finding from the autonomic nervous system research showing that panoramic distance viewing shifts the entire nervous system toward parasympathetic dominance within minutes. All of it comes later. Start with the muscle. Because the physics of how the eye focuses is the physics of a problem that most people have backwards. Human lens is a transparent, flexible, biconvex structure suspended behind the iris by a ring of fibers called the zonules of Zinn. At rest, when the eye is focused at distance, the zonular fibers are under tension, pulling the lens into a flatter shape. Flatter lens has a lower refractive power, focusing parallel light rays from distant objects onto the retina. This is the eye's default optical state. No muscular effort is required. Distance focus is passive. Most people assume the opposite. That distance requires effort because distant objects are far away, and near objects are easy because they are close. The physics is inverted. Parallel light rays from distant objects converge naturally through a relaxed lens. Divergent light rays from near objects require additional bending, additional refractive power, which requires the lens to become more convex, which requires the ciliary muscle to contract. To focus at near objects, the ciliary muscle contracts in a ring around the lens. Contraction releases tension on the zonular fibers, allowing the elastic lens to round up into a more convex shape, increasing its refractive power and bringing divergent light rays from near objects into focus on the retina. This is accommodation, first described mathematically by Helmholtz and confirmed by every optometric measurement since. Key physics: near focus requires active muscular contraction. Distance focus does not. Every moment spent reading, scrolling, or looking at a screen is a moment the ciliary muscle is actively contracting. Every moment spent looking at the horizon is a moment the ciliary muscle is released. The eye at distance is the eye at rest. Person who reads for 2 hours, works at a computer for 4 hours, watches television for 3 hours, and checks their phone throughout, a typical day for many adults, has held the ciliary muscle in sustained contraction for 9 hours or more. The muscle that evolution designed to rest for most of the day is working for most of the day. The fatigue this produces is not imaginary and not psychological. It is muscular, identical in mechanism to the fatigue that any muscle produces when held in sustained contraction without adequate rest periods. The difference is that the ciliary muscle is inside the eye, invisible, and its fatigue is interpreted as deteriorating vision rather than muscular exhaustion. Well, and what happens when the muscle does not release? Because accommodative spasm is a well-documented clinical finding, primarily in children and young adults with high near-work loads, and the milder muscular fatigue it represents persists across the lifespan. Sustained near-focus tasks, hours of reading, screen use, or close-range work can produce a condition in which the ciliary muscle, after prolonged contraction, fails to fully relax when the person looks into the distance. Lens remains partially rounded. Distance vision is blurred. not because the eye has changed shape permanently, but because the muscle controlling the lens is stuck in a contracted state. Physics is identical to the cramping that occurs in any skeletal muscle held in sustained contraction. Metabolic waste accumulates, calcium cycling in the sarcoplasmic reticulum becomes inefficient, and the muscle loses its ability to fully release. The ciliary muscle is smooth muscle rather than skeletal, but the fatigue mechanism is analogous. Sustained activation depletes the calcium recycling capacity, and the muscle cannot return to its resting length on demand. The contraction that was voluntary, initiated by the near-focus demand, becomes involuntary. The muscle is stuck. Condition is called pseudomyopia or accommodative spasm. Pseudomyopia, false nearsightedness, because the blurred distance vision mimics true myopia but disappears when the muscle releases. Cycloplegic eye drops that pharmacologically paralyze the ciliary muscle can demonstrate this. The underlying refractive error disappears when the muscle is forced to relax. The eye is optically normal. The muscle is dysfunctional. In ophthalmology clinics, accommodative spasm is routinely diagnosed in children and young adults who spend excessive time on screens. In older adults, the accommodative range is too reduced for true spasm to occur at the same severity. But ciliary fatigue from sustained contraction persists, producing eye strain, headache, and end-of-day visual fatigue that is attributed to age-related optical changes rather than muscular overuse. Think about what that means, a portion of the visual blur that people attribute to aging. The sense that distance vision is deteriorating, the increasing reliance on updated prescriptions may be partially muscular, not optical. The lens may be normal, the ciliary muscle may be locked, and the intervention is not a stronger prescription. It is releasing the muscle by looking at the distance it was designed to rest at. Population-level evidence confirms that near-focus loading damages the visual system. The global myopia epidemic, prevalence rising from 25% in 1970 to over 30% today, projected to reach 50% by 2050, is driven almost entirely by near work hours and reduced outdoor time. The mechanism in children and young adults is axial elongation. Sustained near focus produces a biochemical signal that causes the eyeball to physically lengthen, focusing distant light in front of the retina. The process is irreversible once the sclera remodels. What matters for the 65-year-old viewer is not the pediatric mechanism, but the protective factor. The research identified time spent outdoors. The Sydney Myopia study by Rose and colleagues and the Guangzhou randomized trial by He and colleagues both found that outdoor time, independent of physical activity, significantly reduced myopia incidence. Mechanism is twofold and applies across the lifespan. Outdoor environments demand distance focus, releasing the ciliary muscle, and outdoor light intensity stimulates retinal dopamine release through anocrine cells in the retina. Indoor lighting delivers roughly 500 lux. Outdoor light on a cloudy day delivers 10,000 lux. Direct sunlight delivers 100,000 lux. Your retina evolved under a light source 200 to 1,000 times brighter than the one it spends most of its modern life under. Retinal dopamine requires outdoor light intensity. A person looking at a distant wall in a 500 lux office is releasing the ciliary muscle, but not producing the dopamine signal that outdoor distance viewing delivers. The distance and the light work together. Neither alone is sufficient, and here is what happens to the accommodative system after 40. Because presbyopia changes the optics, but not the muscular problem, and the muscular problem is the one nobody addresses. At approximately age 40, the human lens begins losing its elasticity, a process called presbyopia. Lens proteins cross-link over decades of ultraviolet exposure and oxidative stress, and the lens hardens progressively. Even when the ciliary muscle contracts fully, the stiffer lens cannot round up enough to focus at near distances. This is the reason for reading glasses. The moment that arrives for nearly every human, usually noticed first when a menu becomes difficult to read or a phone must be held at arm's length. By 60, accommodative amplitude, the range of focus the lens can achieve, has declined from approximately 14 diopters in childhood to approximately 1 diopter. Ciliary muscle still contracts. The lens no longer responds adequately. The effort is unchanged. The result is diminished. And here's the aspect almost never discussed. The ciliary muscle does not know the lens has stiffened. It continues contracting in response to near-focus demands through a dramatically reduced range with diminishing mechanical work, but contracting nonetheless. The sustained contraction produces ciliary fatigue even at the reduced amplitude, not the full accommodative spasm of a 20-year-old, but a persistent muscular effort that contributes to the eye strain, headache, and end-of-day visual fatigue that nearly every adult over 50 reports. That disconnect, the muscle still contracting with diminishing return, producing effort against the lens that barely responds, stopped me when I first encountered it in the optometric literature, because it means reading glasses solve the optical problem while the muscular component persists. The fatigue is smaller than it was at 20. The muscle is working through 1 diopter instead of 14, but it is present, it is daily, and nobody told them it was there. Reading glasses solve the optical problem. They add the refractive power the stiffened lens can no longer provide. They do not address the muscular component. The ciliary muscle is still contracting, still fatiguing across the day, still accumulating the low-grade strain that sustained near focus, produces even at reduced amplitude. The end-of-day visual exhaustion the person attributes to their eyes getting worse includes a muscular component that the prescription did not address. Frustration is specific and recognizable. The person who puts on reading glasses and finds they can see the page clearly, but still feels eye strain, still develops the headache by late afternoon, still rubs their eyes at the end of the day, is experiencing the muscular problem that the optical correction did not address. The glasses corrected the focus. The ciliary muscle is still locked in contraction. The symptoms persist because the cause persists. Looking at the horizon releases that muscle, regardless of whether the lens is still flexible or has stiffened with age. The release is immediate. The muscle relaxes because distance focus is the resting state. The accommodation system does not need the lens to be flexible to benefit from the release. The muscle needs the signal to stop contracting. The horizon provides that signal. The relief the person feels when they step outside and look at the distance after hours of screen work is the ciliary muscle releasing a contraction it has been holding since morning. You see, the visual fatigue of aging is not purely optical. It is partly muscular. And the muscular component responds to the simplest intervention available, looking far away. Well, and the second system the horizon affects. Because the visual system connects to the autonomic nervous system in a way that most people have never been told, and the connection changes what distance viewing means. Visual system has 2 modes of operation that map directly onto the 2 branches of the autonomic nervous system. Focal vision, the narrow, high-resolution central vision used for reading, screens, and close-range detail, is associated with sympathetic nervous system activation. Pupils constrict slightly to increase depth of field. Ciliary muscle contracts. Extraocular muscles converge the eyes. Visual cortex narrows its processing to foveal input. This is the mode of attention, alertness, and close-range threat assessment. Panoramic vision. The wide, low-resolution peripheral vision that processes the entire visual field without fixating on any single point is associated with parasympathetic nervous system activation. The research connecting visual processing mode to autonomic state is consistent in direction. When subjects shift from focal to panoramic gaze, heart rate tends to decrease, respiratory rate tends to slow, and cortisol levels tend to decline. The specific autonomic measurements during panoramic versus focal viewing have not been isolated from the confounding variables of outdoor versus indoor environment with the precision that, say, Singer's fMRI work isolated empathic pain activation. What is established? The visual cortex processes focal and panoramic input through different pathways. The 2 pathways connect to different autonomic circuits, and the subjective and physiological correlates of the 2 modes are consistently reported across studies. The direction is clear. The mechanistic isolation is still being refined. Horizon is the natural stimulus for panoramic vision. Looking at a distant horizon, where no single object demands focal attention, is the visual input that most naturally shifts the nervous system toward parasympathetic dominance. Relaxation people report when looking at the ocean, at a mountain range, at an open field. This is not psychological preference. It is the autonomic nervous system responding to a visual input pattern that signals safety. For the majority of hominin evolutionary history, the ability to see the horizon meant the absence of nearby threats. A clear sightline to the distance meant nothing was close enough to be dangerous. The horizon was the visual signature of safety. The autonomic nervous system is wired to recognize it and respond accordingly, downregulating the sympathetic alertness that close-range focal vision maintains, and upregulating the parasympathetic state that the body uses for rest, digestion, and recovery. The inverse is equally wired, an environment where nothing is visible beyond arm's length, where every visual stimulus is close, detailed, demanding focal processing, is the visual signature of enclosure. Dense vegetation, a confined space, a situation where threat could be anywhere nearby and visual vigilance is required. The autonomic nervous system responds to close-range focal demand with sympathetic activation identical to what it would deploy in a physically enclosed environment, because, for the duration of hominin evolution, close-range visual demand and physical enclosure were the same condition. The screen at 2 feet is, to the autonomic nervous system, indistinguishable from a visually enclosed environment requiring vigilance. The sympathetic activation is not a bug. It is the system running correctly, responding to the visual geometry it evolved to interpret, in a context that the geometry's designers never anticipated. That connection, the visual system driving the autonomic nervous system through the mode of visual processing rather than through what is being seen, is the finding that made the distance viewing research land differently for me, because it means the screen in front of your face is not merely tiring your eyes. It is locking your autonomic nervous system into sympathetic dominance, the state of alertness, of threat readiness, of elevated cortisol for every hour you use it. Content on the screen is irrelevant to this effect. A calming nature documentary viewed on a screen at 2 feet still activates focal vision, still contracts the ciliary muscle, still drives sympathetic tone through the mode of visual processing. The content says, relax. The focal distance says, attend. The autonomic nervous system responds to the focal distance, not to the content. A person watching relaxing content on a phone for 2 hours before bed is delivering a sympathetic, activating visual signal for 2 hours before attempting to sleep, regardless of how calming the material appears. Horizon is the visual stimulus that unlocks the parasympathetic state. 5 minutes of panoramic distance viewing is a nervous system intervention, not an eye exercise. The ciliary muscle releases. The sympathetic tone drops. The autonomic shift, the research consistently reports. Reduced heart rate, increased heart rate variability, declining cortisol, begins as the gaze moves from focal to panoramic at distance. 2 systems so far, the ciliary muscle and the autonomic nervous system. There is a third. Peripheral visual system needs something else that indoor environments cannot provide. Because the periphery processes something distant, viewing delivers and close viewing does not. Now, the peripheral retina does not process detail. It processes motion, specifically optic flow, the pattern of apparent movement in the visual field as the observer moves through space. Forward walking produces radial optic flow, visual elements expanding outward from a central point ahead. This flow pattern, processed by the middle temporal and medial superior temporal visual areas, provides the brain with information about speed, direction, and spatial orientation. It is one of the primary inputs driving the sense of self-motion and the spatial confidence that underlies independent mobility. Indoor environments restrict optic flow. Walls, ceilings, and furniture provide short-distance visual boundaries that limit the spatial information available to the peripheral processing system. The periphery adapted to processing motion across open landscapes, distances measured in hundreds of meters, with rich parallax information from objects at varying depths. A person walking through an open field receives continuous radial optic flow from ground texture, distant trees, clouds, horizon features, all at different distances, all providing depth information through motion parallax. The peripheral visual system processes this entire field simultaneously, constructing a three-dimensional spatial model in real time. Indoor periphery processes motion across rooms, distances measured in meters, with minimal depth variation. Walls are flat, ceilings are uniform. The optic flow is compressed into a narrow depth range that provides almost no parallax information. The peripheral system that evolved to process three-dimensional space at landscape scale is running on a flattened, compressed, impoverished version of the input it was designed to receive. Older adults who spend most of their time indoors in visually constrained environments are depriving the peripheral motion processing system of the spatial input it was calibrated to receive. The hypothesis that follows is mechanistically coherent, but not yet measured with the precision the other mechanisms described here have. The hesitancy and disorientation some older adults experience in open outdoor spaces. The slight unsteadiness walking across a large car park. The preference for walking close to walls or fences may be partly a consequence of peripheral visual deconditioning. The peripheral system does decondition without input, that is established. The input is absent indoors, that is measurable. The direct link between indoor visual restriction and outdoor spatial anxiety has not been isolated in a controlled study, the way Rose isolated outdoor time and myopia. The mechanism is plausible. The evidence is directional. The measurement is still being built. Spatial confidence that younger adults take for granted. The ability to walk across an open space without hesitation, to navigate a busy outdoor environment without anxiety, depends partly on a peripheral visual system that is calibrated to outdoor distances. When the system is deconditioned by years of indoor visual environments, the confidence erodes, not because the legs are weaker or the vestibular system has failed, but because the peripheral visual input the brain uses to construct a real-time spatial model is arriving at a resolution the system has not been asked to maintain. Solution is not avoidance. It is graduated re-exposure. The peripheral system recalibrates when it receives the input it requires at the distances it evolved to process. Walking outdoors in open spaces, even briefly, restores the peripheral flow processing that indoor light suppresses. One more system, and it runs through the eyes but has nothing to do with vision. The circadian mechanism, melanopsin-containing retinal ganglion cells that signal the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the master clock that times cortisol, melatonin, and the entire hormonal cascade runs through the retina that is processing focal distance and panoramic width. The circadian disruption that older adults commonly experience, difficulty falling asleep, early morning waking, afternoon fatigue, is partly a consequence of insufficient retinal light exposure at the intensity the melanopsin system requires. Indoor light at 500 lux does not activate it adequately. Outdoor light at 10,000 lux, even on a cloudy day, does. The cycle that many older adults report, poor sleep producing fatigue, fatigue producing indoor behavior producing inadequate light producing worse sleep, is a circadian drift reinforced by the indoor environment that caused it. The intervention that breaks the cycle is not a sleep medication. It is outdoor light. Looking at the horizon outdoors delivers three interventions simultaneously: the distance stimulus that releases the ciliary muscle, the panoramic input that shifts the autonomic balance, and the light intensity that synchronizes the circadian clock. Three systems. One behavior: going outside and looking far away. No other single behavior simultaneously addresses muscular fatigue in the eye, autonomic imbalance in the nervous system, and circadian desynchronization in the hypothalamus. A pharmaceutical that produced all three effects would require three separate prescriptions acting on three separate organ systems. The horizon produces all three through a single sensory input: distance, panorama, and light. delivered to a single organ that connects to all three systems. The eye is the input device. The ciliary muscle, the autonomic nervous system, and the suprachiasmatic nucleus are the three downstream targets. The horizon activates all of them because the eye evolved as the interface between the external light environment and the internal regulatory systems that depend on it. Think about the person who spends most of their day indoors, reading, watching television, using a computer, and goes outside for 5 minutes in the morning to look at the farthest visible point. In those 5 minutes, the ciliary muscle releases from sustained contraction. The release begins within seconds of the gaze shifting to distance, and the muscle reaches full relaxation within approximately 30 seconds. The autonomic balance shifts toward parasympathetic dominance, the shift that panoramic distance viewing tends to produce, as the focal to panoramic mode change releases the sympathetic activation that close-range processing maintains. The circadian clock receives the light signal it needs to correctly time the day's hormone cascade. Melanopsin activation in the IPRGCs begins immediately upon outdoor light exposure and reaches full signaling within approximately 10 minutes. The peripheral visual system receives optic flow at distances it cannot access indoors, recalibrating the motion processing circuits to the spatial scale they evolved to operate at. 4 systems reset by a single environmental exposure. The person returns indoors 5 minutes later with a released ciliary muscle, a shifted autonomic balance, a synchronized circadian clock, and a recalibrated peripheral visual system. The screen will reactivate all 4 problems. But the 5 minutes outdoors broke the cycle, provided the muscular release, the autonomic shift, the light signal, and the spatial input that indoor life denies, and that the body requires not occasionally, but daily. You see? Eyes looking at this screen right now are in a state their evolution never prepared them for. Sustained near focus, under indoor light, processing foveal detail for hours without interruption. Ciliary muscles are contracted. Autonomic nervous system is in sympathetic mode. Circadian clock is understimulated. Peripheral visual system is idle. Every one of these states reverses when you walk outside and look at the farthest thing you can see. Not because the horizon heals anything, because the horizon is the default. The state your eyes are in right now is the departure. Distance was always home.